5 alternative titles. 1. She had 30 days before they took her orphans away, the rancher who walked in for supper walked out owning nothing but gave them everything. 2. They handed her the eviction papers, while 12 children slept inside. The silent rancher nobied his own life to the ground to save theirs. 3. The businessman came with legal papers and a smile she had nothing left to fight with, until a stranger shows up and traded his ranch for 12 children's future. 4. She invited him to supper because he'd sent firewood without his name on it. He left that table and walked straight into the hardest decision a man could make. 5. Nobody in town would help her keep those children from being scattered to the wind until the loneliest man in Montana sat down at her table and never fully got back up. Clara Whitmore read the eviction notice 3 times before her hands stopped shaking, not because the words changed, but because she needed every second to decide whether she was going to fall apart or fight. She chose to fight. She always did. If this story moved something in you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single episode. And before we go any further, drop your city in the comments right now. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. Now stay with me all the way to the end, because what this rancher did next is something I promise you will not see coming. Part 1. The notice had been nailed to the front door sometime before sunrise. Clara found it when she stepped outside to shake the dust from the breakfast cloth, the cold October air hitting her face like a slap she hadn't braced for. The paper was stiff and formal, stamped with the seal of a legal office in Helena, and it had been folded with the particular crispness of a document someone wanted taken seriously. She stood on the porch in her worn gray dress, the cloth still clutched in both hands, and she read it word by word. By the authority vested in the Caldwell Land and Commerce Company, the property currently operating as the Whitmore Orphan Home, located on the eastern edge of Harlan Creek, Montana, was to be vacated and surrendered no later than 60 days from the date of posting. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal seizure. Clara read it again. 60 days. She looked up from the paper and stared out at the flat morning sky, pale and colorless as a sheet of old linen. Somewhere inside the building behind her, she could hear Lily talking in her sleep the way she always did, murmuring small serious words into her pillow. She could hear the older boys beginning to stir, their boots scraping the floorboards as they dressed. 12 children. 12 lives that had already been broken once, and then carefully, painstakingly put back together inside these walls. And now someone with a stamp and a legal signature wanted to scatter them again. Clara folded the notice slowly, pressed it flat along the crease, and slid it into her apron pocket. Then she went inside and made breakfast. She fried the salt pork and stirred the cornmeal and poured the milk into the tin cups, and she set every plate at the table the same way she did every morning, and she did not say a single word about the paper in her pocket. Not yet. The children sat down and ate and argued over the last of the bread, and Lily knocked her cup over and started crying, and the older boy named Noah cleaned it up without being asked, the way he always quietly cleaned things up without being asked. Clara watched all of it and kept her face calm. She was very good at keeping her face calm. She had learned it out of necessity, the way a woman learns most of her hardest skills. But when the last child had gone out to morning chores and the table stood empty, Clara sat down in her chair, pressed both palms flat against the wood, and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Everett Caldwell. She knew the name. Everyone in Harlan Creek knew the name. He had arrived in town 8 months ago, bringing with him 3 lawyers, a land surveyor, and a quiet, confident manner that made him seem like a man who had never once been told no. He had purchased the old mill and turned it into a trading post. He had bought the Hendricks family's failed grain operation for 1/3 of what it was worth, and then leased it back to surrounding farms at prices that put him in a comfortable position of power. He had shaken every hand in town, attended the Presbyterian church twice, and spoken at a town council meeting about the importance of progress and economic development in the New West. Clara had listened to that speech from the back row. She had watched how the men leaned forward and nodded. She had watched how the women glanced at their husbands. She had known, even then, that Everett Caldwell was the kind of man who dressed his ambitions in the language of community benefit. And now he wanted her land. It wasn't just the building, though the building itself sat on a full acre of the most level ground on the eastern edge of town. What Caldwell wanted, according to a rumor she'd heard from the mercantile owner's wife 3 weeks ago, was a livestock trading station, a central hub where ranchers from the surrounding territory could bring their cattle and horses for sale and exchange, all of it flowing through Caldwell's operation. All of it generating fees and commissions that would collect in his pocket like water finding its natural level. It was by any measure a shrewd business plan. Clara had no argument against the business logic. What she had was 12 children with nowhere else to go. She spent the morning doing what she always did when she needed to think without appearing to panic. She laundered the bedding. She repaired a loose board on the back step. She helped the youngest girls with their reading lesson, sitting with them at the kitchen table while they traced letters on their slates, her voice steady and patient, even as her mind worked through the problem, like fingers working through a knot. By midday she had a short list. Reverend Alcott at the church, who had helped her before and might be willing to speak publicly on behalf of the home. The town council, who technically had some authority over commercial developments within Harlan Creek's boundaries. Judge Patterson over in the county seat, who was known as a fair man. And 2 or 3 of the more established families in town who had donated in the past and might be moved to do more. She visited every one of them before sundown. Reverend Alcott was sympathetic. He pressed her hands between his and said he would pray on it. The town council's chairman, a dry goods merchant named Holt, told her the council had no jurisdiction over private property transactions and that she might want to consult a lawyer. Judge Patterson was out of the county until the following month. The first family she visited had company from out of town. The second offered her $20 and an apology. The third was polite but non-committal in the way that means no, with the particular refinement of people who dislike delivering difficult news directly. Clara walked home in the dark. She did not walk slowly. She was not a woman who walked slowly when she was frightened, because walking slowly gave fear too much room. She walked the way she always walked, with her back straight, and her stride deliberate, and she let herself feel exactly as hopeless as the situation warranted, because she had learned that pretending away despair was its own kind of danger. You had to let it sit beside you for a moment, look it in the face, and then decide you were going to keep moving anyway. She was almost to the home when she remembered what old Ada Greer had said to her at the mercantile counter 2 weeks ago. Ada was the kind of woman who knew everything that happened within 20 miles of Harlan Creek, simply because she paid attention and asked the right questions, and she had leaned across the counter and said in her unhurried way, "You hear about the rancher out past the ridge, Calloway? Quiet man. Keeps to himself mostly, but I'll tell you something, somebody sent your children a full quart of firewood last month, and it wasn't nobody in this town who'll take credit." Clara had thought about it briefly and then set it aside, because she had no way to trace anonymous kindness and she had more immediate problems to manage. But now she stood in the dark outside her own front door, and she thought about it again. Firewood, blankets. She hadn't connected them before the wool blankets that appeared on the back step in September with no note, the basket of medical herbs that someone left tied to the fence post before the first frost. She had assumed it was church women who preferred not to be named, which happened sometimes. Quiet generosity wrapped in anonymity, but Ada had said Calloway. Clara went to find him the next morning. She left the older children in charge of breakfast and walked to the far side of the market district where she'd been told Mason Calloway came in twice a week to handle supplies and business. She didn't know what he looked like. She only knew what Ada had told her: big man, quiet, dark hat, doesn't linger. She spotted him at the feed store loading sacks, with the focused efficiency of a man who had measured every task in his life down to the exact amount of effort required. Clara walked directly toward him. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He turned around slowly. He was exactly as Ada had described, broad-shouldered, somewhere past 40, with a face that had been shaped by weather and years of keeping most of its expression carefully managed. He looked at her with clear brown eyes that were neither unfriendly nor particularly open. "Ma'am," he said, the word carrying that particular Western courtesy that acknowledged a stranger without committing to anything. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I run the orphan home on the east side of town." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, a slight tightening around the jaw. "I know of it," he said. "I came to thank you," Clara said. "For the firewood. And the blankets, I think, though I can't be certain of that one. And the herbs before the first frost." He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him deciding how to handle the fact that his anonymity had been uncovered. "Wasn't anything special," he said finally. "It kept 12 children warm through October," Clara said. "That was very special to them, even if they don't know your name." He picked up another feed sack and set it in the wagon with the same steady economy of motion. "They doing all right?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected. She had come here anticipating at least basic interest in the children, but because of how he asked it. Not with the polished concern of someone performing sympathy. With the direct, specific curiosity of someone who had actually thought about the answer. "They were," Clara said. "Until yesterday she told him about the notice. Not all of it, not the legal details and the timeline. Just the essential shape of it. A wealthy businessman, legal papers, 60 days, 12 children with nowhere to go." She watched his face while she talked. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer immediate solutions or reassuring words. He simply listened with the full focused attention of a man who understood that some situations required listening before anything else. When she finished, he was quiet. Then he said, "What does he want the land for?" "A livestock trading station." He nodded once, slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected about the shape of the world. "Have you talked to anyone in town?" "Everyone I could reach," Clara said. "The church, the council, 2 families who've helped before. Nobody can or will do what actually needs doing." "Which is?" She looked at him steadily. "Someone needs to buy that property before Caldwell does." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, toward the street, and there was something in his profile that she couldn't entirely read. Not unwillingness, exactly, but the expression of a man confronting a thought he hadn't expected to have. "I appreciate you coming to tell me," he said. It wasn't a commitment. It wasn't a refusal. It was the honest response of a man who hadn't made up his mind yet. Clara looked toward the road that led back to the Orphaned home. "Will you come to supper?" she asked. "Tonight. I won't ask you for anything else. The children should know who's been keeping them warm. They deserve to know that." He looked at her again. The brown eyes were direct and a little surprised. "What time?" he said. He nodded once. "I'll be there." Mason Calloway arrived at 6 o'clock exactly. He came on horseback and tied his horse at the fence post and stood outside the door for a moment, before knocking the way a man stands when he is preparing himself for something he isn't entirely certain how to navigate. Clara heard the knock and opened the door and found him standing there with his hat, in his hands, dark hat, just as Ada had said, and the look on his face of a man who has walked into the edge of something much larger than he expected. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and stepped inside. What happened in the next 10 seconds was something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. The children were in the main room, all 12 of them, varying ages from Lily at 4 years old to Noah at 16, and they all turned to look at the man who had just walked through the door. There was a moment of collective assessment, the way children assess a new adult, fast, thorough, and entirely honest in its conclusions. And then Lily, who was sitting on the floor with a small cloth rabbit, looked up at Mason Calloway and said with absolute certainty, "You're the firewood man." Mason stopped. He looked down at Lily. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not in the large theatrical way of a man performing emotion, but in the smaller, truer way of a man ambushed by a feeling he hadn't seen coming, something behind his eyes that loosened lightly and then steadied, the way a lamp flame settles after a draft passes through a room. "I reckon I am," he said. "I thought you'd be older," Lily said thoughtfully. The children laughed, even Noah, who rarely laughed, who had a 16-year-old's careful management of his own dignity. Mason looked at Clara. She was smiling. He sat down at her table, and the meal was simple and honest. The way every meal Clara made was simple and honest: salt pork and fried potatoes and good bread and dried apple preserves that she saved for occasions worth marking. The children ate and talked and forgot to be on their best behavior almost immediately, which was the best possible outcome of any supper. And Mason Calloway sat in the middle of all of it, with his hands around a tin cup of coffee, and the look of a man who had been traveling alone for a very long time and had just, without meaning to, come inside out of the weather. He didn't say much during supper. He didn't need to. The children talked enough for any 10 adults, and Clara let them, watching how Mason responded, not with performance, but with attention. When 11-year-old James asked him a direct question about horses, he answered it directly. When 8-year-old Dora spilled her plate and went crimson with embarrassment, he picked up the fork that had clattered to the floor and handed it back to her without comment. The casual grace of it erasing her shame so completely that she was talking again within 30 seconds. Noah watched him the whole meal. Clara noticed. Noah watched every adult the whole meal, always with the particular vigilance of a boy who had been disappointed enough times to reserve judgment entirely until evidence accumulated. He didn't speak to Mason, but he also didn't look away. After supper, Clara sent the younger children to get ready for bed and the older ones to handle the evening chores. And she and Mason sat at the cleared table with fresh coffee and the specific kind of quiet that exists between two adults after a loud and lively meal. "They're good children," Mason said. "They're remarkable children," Clara said. "Every one of them. You should know what they came from. Not for pity, they don't want pity, and I wouldn't give it to them. But because they've earned being known." She told him about them, one by one. Not the statistics of how they'd been orphaned: disease, accident, desertion, the grinding failures of poverty in the New West, but who they actually were. Lily's improbable fearlessness, Noah's quiet, steady competence that at 16 already surpassed most adults. James's mechanical curiosity and the way he took everything apart to understand it. Dora's singing, which was unexpectedly beautiful and which she performed only when she thought no one was listening. The twins, Bess and May, who had arrived together from a typhoid epidemic in Billings, and who still, a year later, held hands when they walked anywhere unfamiliar. Mason listened to all of it. He asked specific ones, not general ones. Not how are the younger ones doing, but what does Noah want to do when he's grown, and does Lily sleep all right, and has James had a chance to work with any actual machinery? Clara answered everyone. By the time it was cold, she understood something about Mason Calloway that she doubted many people in Harlan Creek had taken the time to understand. He was not a cold man. He was not an indifferent man. He was a man who had learned to keep his care at a careful distance from the world, because the world had demonstrated, at some point, what happened when he didn't. The distance was protective, not natural. Underneath it was something that had been looking for a place to land for a very long time. "I lost my wife," he said, at some point in the evening, and the way he said it simply, without preamble, the way you name a permanent thing, told her it wasn't a new grief so much as a settled one. The kind that doesn't make you fall apart anymore, but never entirely leaves you either. 7-year fever. It was fast. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "We never had children," he said. She wanted them. "I did too. There just wasn't time." Clara said nothing. She understood the particular weight of things that didn't happen. She'd carried enough of them herself. "You built all of this yourself?" Mason asked, looking around the room. The house was already here. It was a failed homestead. "I bought it for almost nothing when I was 26 because nobody else wanted it, and I needed space for the children I was already caring for." Clara wrapped both hands around her cold cup. "That was 8 years ago. There were 3 children then. There are 12 now. Where do you get the money to run it?" Donations, church drives, what I make from taking in laundry and selling eggs. A little from the county, though that stopped 2 years ago when the budget was cut. She paused. We manage, looked at her. You manage, he said. By yourself. The children help Noah especially. And there are a few women in town who assist when they can. She met his eyes. But yes, mostly by myself. He was quiet for a moment. That's a heavy load, ma'am. It's my load, Clara said simply. I wouldn't trade it. The honesty of it seemed to land on him in a way that mattered. He left an hour later, saying goodnight to the few children still up with a brief awkward warmth that made Lily grab his hand and squeeze it once before running to her room. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands again, and Clara stood at the threshold, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, I'll think on the situation, Miss Clara. Not Miss Whitmore, Miss Clara, she noticed. That's all I can ask, she said. He walked to his horse, and Clara stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the dark road, and then she closed the door and stood with her back against it in the quiet. She didn't know what Mason Calloway would do. She didn't know if thinking on the situation meant anything at all, or was just the Western way of saying farewell without closing the door entirely. What she knew was that for the first time since she'd found that notice nailed to her door, she didn't feel entirely alone in the weight of what was coming. And what she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that upstairs in the dark, Lily had knelt beside her bed and said her prayers the way she did every night, but tonight she'd added something new at the end. In her small, serious voice, to whoever she believed was listening. And please let the firewood man come back. She fell asleep before she could hear whether the answer was yes. But the next morning, before Clara had even started the breakfast fire, there was a knock at the door. She opened it and found Mason Calloway on the step with a coil of rope over one shoulder and his tools on his belt and a look on his face like a man who had made a decision sometime in the night and was done deliberating about it. That back fence looked like it needed work, he said. Clara stepped aside. He walked in. And from that morning forward, Mason Calloway became a part of the life of the Whitmore orphan home in the way that some things happen in this world, not through great dramatic announcement, but through the steady accumulation of small, irreversible choices that add up over time, something that cannot be undone. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He came with tools and with supplies, and with the quiet, capable energy of a man who saw what needed doing and did it without waiting to be asked. He fixed the fence, and then the window on the east side that had been letting in cold air since the previous winter. He brought a second cord of firewood and stacked it himself against the side of the building with the geometric precision of a man who understood how long a Montana winter could be. The children watched him at first with the careful reserve they offered all new adults. But Mason had a quality that children recognized instinctively and could not be faked. He did not perform his attention. When he was talking to you, he was talking to you. When he was working near you, he was aware of you. He did not talk down. He did not over-explain. He treated the children as people with functional minds and legitimate perspectives, and for children who had spent a significant portion of their lives being treated as burdens or charity cases, this was as nourishing as anything Clara put on their table. Noah was the last to let him in. This was predictable. Noah had been 16 years old for exactly 6 months, and in that time he had developed the particular fortress of adolescent dignity that requires a certain kind of respect to dismantle. He watched Mason work for 4 days without saying more than yes, sir, and no, sir, and Mason never pushed it, never made overtures. Just let the boy keep his distance with the patience of a man who understood that some things you had to earn at the other person's pace. On the 5th day, Mason was working on a section of the barn roof, and Noah appeared below him without being asked, holding the lumber steady that Mason needed to keep from sliding. They worked like that for 2 hours without a word. Then Mason said from above, "You know anything about roofing?" "Come up," Mason said. Noah climbed up. They worked for the rest of the afternoon together, and by the end of it they were talking, not about anything of consequence. about the lumber and the angle of the pitch and whether it was going to rain before they finished, but talking, which was the thing. And Clara watched from below with a feeling in her chest that she couldn't have named exactly, but that had something to do with Whitnick's, the beginning of something that mattered. The supper invitations became regular. At first Clara extended them specifically, and Mason accepted specifically Tuesday and Thursday, the days he came to town for supply runs. Then it became easier than that. Then it became assumed. The children set his place without being asked. Lily began saving him the seat next to hers, which she defended with the territorial conviction of a 4-year-old who has decided that something is hers. One night, after supper, Lily brought him a small book with a torn cover, a collection of frontier stories she'd been given by one of the churchwomen, and held it out to him with the absolute confidence of someone presenting an offering of obvious worth. "Read to me," she said. Mason looked at the book. He looked at Lily. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who was about to do something slightly terrifying and had decided to do it anyway. Clara gave him the smallest nod. He opened the book. He wasn't a man who read aloud much. She could tell that immediately. His voice was too careful, too deliberate, working through each sentence with the concentration of someone who took reading seriously, but had not done it often in the presence of other people. But within 3 pages, the other children had drifted in from the edges of the room, one by one, the way children do when they sense something worth attending to. And they arranged themselves around him, on the floor and on the bench and against the wall, and Mason Calloway sat in the middle of all of them and read the story straight through without stopping. When he finished, Lily was asleep against his arm. He looked down at her. Then he looked up at Clara. There was something on his face that she had not seen there before. Something that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unhappy. Something that looked, if she was honest about it, like a man beginning to understand that the walls he'd built to keep himself safe had also been keeping something out that he needed. "I'll get her," Clara said quietly. "No," Mason said. "I got her." He carried Lily to her bed. He came back to the main room and stood for a moment at the edge of it, looking at the children settling into their evening routines. And Clara watched him from the kitchen doorway, and neither of them said anything at all. Then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "Good night, Miss Clara," he said. "Good night, Mr. Calloway," she said. He walked out into the cold, and Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around the dish she was drying, and she thought about a man who had shown up to fix a fence and had ended up carrying a sleeping child to bed. 3 weeks after the notice arrived, a second document appeared. This one was delivered by hand by a young legal clerk who came to the front door and asked for Miss Clara Whitmore, and presented the envelope with the formal discomfort of someone who knew the contents weren't welcome. Clara took it calmly, thanked him, closed the door, and stood with her back to the door to read it. The timeline had been accelerated. Caldwell's people had apparently expedited the legal filing. The 60 days had become 30. Clara folded the notice exactly as she had folded the first one, and put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the kitchen to finish what she'd been doing. She did not let her hands shake. She did not sit down at the table and press her palms against the wood. Not yet. But that evening, when Mason arrived and the children were settled and the kitchen was quiet, she put both notices on the table between them. And she looked at him, without pretending, without managing her expression, without performing the calm that had gotten her through 3 weeks of this. 30 days, she said. Mason read both documents. He was quiet for a long time. "What's the property worth?" he asked. Clara told him. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means a man is doing mathematics that extends beyond numbers. "I need to think," he said. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. And she looked at him. And in the silence between them, in the October kitchen with the cold pressing at the windows and 12 children sleeping above their heads, something passed between them that was not yet anything with a name. But it was the beginning of one. "Whatever you're thinking," Clara said quietly, "don't sacrifice more than you can live without, Mr. Calloway. These children have survived loss. I won't add yours to what they carry." Mason held her gaze for a long moment. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that some things are worth the risk." He picked up his hat, and he walked out into the 30-day night. Mason rode home that night with the 2 folded notices sitting in his coat pocket like a pair of stones. He didn't take them out when he got back to the ranch. He unsaddled his horse, worked through the evening chores the way he always did, methodical and quiet, and then he sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before he drank it and stared at the wall for a long time. 30 days. He knew exactly what the property was worth. Clara had told him, and the number she'd given him was honest, not inflated, not diminished, just the plain fair market value of an acre of good level ground on the east side of Harlan Creek, with a standing building in reasonable condition. It was not an impossible number. It was not a small one either. Mason had money. He'd built this ranch over 16 years, with the particular discipline of a man who spent carefully and wasted nothing, and there was enough in the Helena bank account to cover the purchase with something left over. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what came after. Because buying the Orphan Homes property wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of a fight with Everett Caldwell, who was the kind of man who did not lose gracefully and who had lawyers and money and the kind of quiet institutional influence that could make a man's life difficult in ways that were hard to anticipate and harder to counter. And Mason had a ranch to run, employees who depended on him, livestock obligations that stretched through the spring season, and a life that was precisely calibrated to the amount of complication he had decided to allow into it. He had decided, 7 years ago, after Eleanor died, that simplicity was the only honest response to loss. Not happiness. Happiness had seemed too ambitious at the time, too far away to aim for. Just simplicity, manageable days, work that was clear and finite. No attachments that could be taken from him. It had been a reasonable plan. It had also been, he was beginning to understand, the loneliest plan he had ever made. He got up from the table, went to the window, and stood there looking out at the dark of the ranch, his land, his fences, his barns, everything he'd built since Eleanor, and he thought about Lily falling asleep against his arm. He thought about Noah climbing up onto the roof without being asked. He thought about Clara sitting across from him in her kitchen with both hands wrapped around a cold cup, and her eyes absolutely level and honest, not performing courage but simply being it. The way some people are brave, not because they feel no fear, but because they've decided fear is not the point. He thought about what she'd said before he left. Don't sacrifice more than you can live without. He stood at the window for a long time, then he went to bed. He was back at the orphan home the next morning before 7 o'clock. Clara was at the stove when he knocked, and she opened the door and looked at him with the careful expression of a woman who had trained herself not to expect things so that disappointment couldn't get a running start. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "I talked to my banker this morning," Mason said. "By telegraph." He paused. "I wanted to know the exact numbers before I came." Clara was very still, and she said, "I can buy the property," he said. "I have enough, but I need you to understand something first." He stepped inside. Clara closed the door behind him and turned to face him, and the kitchen was quiet around them, the children not yet up, the morning outside gray and cold. "Caldwell is not going to take this quietly," Mason said. "When I make a counter offer at the auction, he's going to know it's me. And men like him don't stop at losing one transaction. They look for other angles. He might go after my grazing permits. He might put pressure on the men I do business with. He might find some legal technicality in my land holdings that gives him leverage. I need you to know that, because it doesn't just affect me. It affects the children, and it affects you, if he decides the easiest way to get back at me is through you." Clara held his gaze. "I've been fighting men like Caldwell my whole life," she said. "Men who decide other people's lives are inconvenient obstacles to their own ambitions." "I'm not afraid of him. I know you're not," Mason said. "That's not why I'm telling you. I'm telling you because you deserve to make an informed decision about whether you want me involved in this. Because once I'm in it all the way, and that changes things." The kitchen was very quiet. Then Clara said, "Are you asking my permission to help me?" Mason looked at her for a moment. "I reckon I am," he said. Something moved across Clara's face, not sentiment exactly, but the particular expression of a woman, encountering a form of respect she hadn't known she was missing until she felt it. "You have it," she said. He nodded once. "Then I'll need to know exactly when the auction is scheduled, and I'll need to start putting the paperwork together today." They were still talking through the details when the first children came downstairs, and Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair at a magnificent angle from sleep and said, with complete seriousness, "Are you staying for breakfast?" "Firewood man." And the weight of the conversation lifted just enough to let them both breathe. "There's enough," Mason said. Lily considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old managing household resources. There's enough, she decided. There was enough. But the day that followed the breakfast was not a simple one. Clara had gone to see Reverend Alcott again, this time with Mason's name and his commitment to the purchase as concrete information rather than hope, expecting the church's backing to follow as a matter of course. She was wrong. Reverend Alcott received her in his study with his usual warmth, clasped her hands, listened carefully, and then sat back in his chair with an expression that Clara had learned to dread, the expression of a man about to explain, in sympathetic terms, why he cannot do what you need him to do. "Clara," he said, "I think what Mr. Calloway is doing is admirable. Genuinely. But the church's involvement in a direct commercial counter to Caldwell's interests, I have to think about my congregation. Several of my most generous donors are men who have business relationships with Caldwell. If I publicly oppose him, I put those relationships at risk, and that affects what we can do for the entire community, not just the orphan home." 12 children, Clara said. "That's what we're talking about, Reverend. 12 children who have already lost everything once." "I know," he said, "and it hurts my heart, but I can offer prayers, Clara. I can offer the pulpit for an appeal. I can encourage private donations. What I cannot do is take an institutional position against a man this powerful, without risking more than I'm authorized to risk." Clara stood up. She was not a woman who made scenes. She was not a woman who raised her voice in reverence studies or used her emotions as weapons. But she looked at Alcott with eyes that were completely clear and said quietly, "I hope, Reverend, that when those children are old enough to understand what happened, there's an answer ready for why the church offered prayers but not action." She walked out. She was 2 blocks from the church when Margaret Holloway fell into step beside her. Margaret Holloway was one of the most prominent women in Harlan Creek, wife of the largest landowner in the district, socially immovable, and possessed of the particular authority that comes from being someone everyone wants to stay on good terms with. She was not unkind. She was not precisely cruel. She was the kind of woman who had absorbed the social rules of her world so completely that she no longer experienced them as rules but as simple reality, the way a fish doesn't experience water. "Clara," she said, matching her pace, "I heard about the second notice." "I'm very sorry." "Thank you, Margaret. I also heard that Mason Calloway has been spending a considerable amount of time at the orphan home." Clara kept walking. "He's been helping with repairs," she said. "More than repairs, from what I understand." Margaret's voice was gentle and relentless at once. "Clara, I want to say this because I care about you and about your reputation in this community. People are beginning to talk. A single woman running a home for children and a single man making regular visits, it creates an impression that I don't think serves either of you well." Clara stopped walking. She turned to face Margaret with a patience she was having to consciously manufacture. "Margaret," she said, "I have 30 days to save 12 children from being put out of their home. I have a man willing to help me do that, who has asked for nothing in return and treated those children with more genuine kindness than most of this town has shown them in years. If people want to spend that 30 days talking about impressions instead of about what's actually happening, then that is their choice, and it says everything necessary about their priorities." Margaret opened her mouth. "I do appreciate your concern," Clara said, with absolute finality, and she walked away. She was shaking slightly by the time she got back to the orphan home, and she made herself stand on the back step for 60 seconds before going in, breathing the cold October air in and out and letting the anger settle into something she could use. She had no time for fury that didn't go anywhere productive. She had 29 days left and a battle to fight. Mason was in the yard when she came around the side of the building, working with Noah on a section of the water trough that had been leaking since summer. They were working in the particular silence that had developed between them over the past week, comfortable, collaborative, neither of them talking more than the task required. Noah looked up when Clara appeared. He read her face the way he read everything, quickly and accurately. "Bad morning," he said. "Not the worst," Clara said. "Where are the little ones?" "Bess and May are with Dora doing reading. James is in the barn trying to understand how the pulley system works. Lily is somewhere being a catastrophe, I assume. She's teaching the chickens a song," Mason said, without looking up from what he was doing. "I walked past 20 minutes ago. They were not receptive." Noah almost smiled. Clara almost did too, and the almost was enough to take the shaking out of her hands. That evening, after supper and after the children were in bed, Mason stayed at the kitchen table. This had become their quiet time, the hour after the children were down, when the house settled and there was space to talk without managing anyone's fears. It was a thing that had developed naturally, without discussion, the way the fence repairs and the supper invitations had developed, through simple repetition until it was simply what happened. "The Reverend won't help," Clara said. "I didn't expect he would," Mason said. "You knew? Caldwell gave a significant donation to the church fund in August." Ada Greer mentioned it. He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Men who give large donations early aren't doing it out of generosity. They're doing it to build obligation." Clara stared at the table. "He thought of everything," she said. "He's been planning this longer than 30 days, Mason said. "Probably longer than 60. The notice was the last step, not the first. He's been positioning himself in this town for 8 months. He paused. "Which means we need to think about who he hasn't gotten to yet. The people he didn't think he needed." Clara looked at him. "The women," Mason nodded slowly. "The council is his. The church is compromised. The established money in this town is either his or afraid of him. But the women who help you, the ones who bring food, who donate to the drives, who send their older daughters to help on laundry days. He didn't bother with them. They don't have financial leverage and they can't vote, so he didn't see the point." "They can't stop the sale," Clara said. "No," Mason agreed. "But they can make noise. And noise does something money can't always do. It makes the men around Caldwell wonder what it looks like to be standing next to him while the women of their town are publicly saying that 12 children are being put out of their home for a livestock trading profit. Reputation is a currency too." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been thinking about this all week," he said simply. She looked at him across the table. This quiet man who showed up before 7 in the morning and stayed until the children were asleep, and had apparently been running strategic analysis in his head between roofing jobs and water trough repairs. And she felt something shift in her chest that she immediately decided not to examine too carefully, because she had 29 days and a battle to fight, and she could not afford to be distracted by the particular feeling of realizing that someone had been quietly carrying your problem as if it were their own. "All right," she said. "Tell me what you're thinking." He told her. The plan was not complicated, which was part of why it might work. Mason would formalize his bid for the property through the Helena office by end of week, which would force the auction into a legal framework where Caldwell's people couldn't simply acquire through private arrangement. Meanwhile, Clara would organize the women of Harlan Creek not into a formal petition, which required council support, but into something more immediate and harder to ignore. A public gathering at the town meeting, scheduled for the following Tuesday, where they would stand and speak, one by one, about the children and what the home meant to the community. Not a legal challenge, a moral one, in front of every man in that room who had a wife sitting next to him. He can't buy silence from 30 women who are angry, Mason said. Some of them will be afraid to speak, Clara said. Yes, he said. But some of them won't, and the ones who won't will give the ones who are afraid something to stand behind. Clara thought about Ada Greer, who was afraid of nothing and had been wanting someone to fight Caldwell since the moment he arrived in Harlan Creek. She thought about Hannah Reeves, the blacksmith's wife, who had lost her own child to fever the previous winter and who brought food to the orphan home every other week, without fail. She thought about the 6 or 7 others she could name, without hesitation, women who had the kind of bone-deep moral clarity that doesn't require permission. It might not be enough, she said. No, Mason agreed. It might not be, but it's what we have, and doing nothing is not a thing I'm willing to consider. Clara looked at him. Neither am I, she said. The next morning she went to see Ada Greer. Ada was behind her counter at the Mercantile when Clara walked in, and she took one look at Clara's face and said, "Sit down and tell me everything," and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. Clara told her everything. Ada listened with her elbows on the counter and her eyes sharp and still. And when Clara finished, Ada said, "How many women do you need?" "As many as will come. Give me 3 days," Asa said. "I have 28. I only need 3, Ada said firmly. She was right. In 3 days, Ada Greer had spoken to every woman in Harlan Creek worth speaking to, and by the end of it, 22 of them had committed to appearing at the Tuesday town meeting. Not signing a petition, appearing, standing up in that room in public on record. When Clara told Mason the number, he was quiet for a moment. 22, he said. 22, she confirmed. He nodded, slowly. Caldwell won't know what hit him, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite satisfaction, but was close enough to it that Clara felt the first genuine warmth of the week move through her. But 2 days before the town meeting, the third blow arrived. This one didn't come by mail. It came in the form of Edward Holt, the dry goods chairman of the town council, appearing at the orphan home's front door on a Thursday afternoon, hat in hand, looking like a man who was deeply uncomfortable with the task he'd been assigned, but who was going to complete it regardless. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." Clara let him in. She did not offer coffee. Holt sat at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and told her, in the measured tone of a man delivering a prepared statement, that the town council had received a legal inquiry from the Caldwell Land and Commerce Company regarding the orphan home's operating license. Clara felt the cold move into her. "Our operating license," she said. "It appears," Holt said, looking at the table rather than at her, "that the license granted to the home 8 years ago contained a provision requiring renewal every 5 years with a formal inspection of the premises and a review of operational funding. That renewal was due approximately 14 months ago." Clara's hands were flat on the table. "Nobody told me that," she said. "I understand. It appears it was overlooked." Holt had the decency to look pained by the word. "But the provision is in the original document, and Caldwell's lawyers have filed a complaint with the county, arguing that the orphan home has been operating without a valid license for over a year, which could constitute grounds for immediate closure rather than waiting for the auction." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "Immediate," Clara said. "Within 10 days, Holt said, if the county clerk upholds the complaint." Clara sat very still for a very long moment. Then she said, "What would I need to do to renew the license?" Holt shifted in his chair. "A formal inspection by the county health officer. Documentation of operational funding for the next fiscal year. 2 letters of support from standing community members, members of the council or the church specifically." He paused. "The council, as you know, is not in a position, Reverend Alcott," Clara said. Holt said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Clara looked at the wall. Not 30, not 28. 10. She heard Mason's horse in the yard before she heard the knock, and she was already at the door when he came up the steps, and something in her face made him stop halfway through his greeting. "What happened?" he said. It was not a question, she told him. He came inside and read the documentation Holt had left behind, and his jaw tightened in a way she was learning to recognize, not anger exactly, but the compression of a man taking something very serious into himself and deciding how to respond to it with both accuracy and control. He found a procedural angle, Mason said. He's been planning for every contingency, Clara said. He wants us running in circles. He wants us chasing paperwork while the clock runs down. Then we don't chase it the way he expects us to. Mason set down the papers. The license requires 2 letters from council or church members. Alcott won't write one. Holt won't write one. But the provision says council or church. It doesn't specify this church, and it doesn't specify this council. Clara stared at him. Judge Patterson, she said slowly, is a standing member of the Episcopal vestry in Helena, which constitutes a church appointment under territorial law. Mason's voice was level. And the county health officer's inspection can be requested by any licensed property owner in the territory, not just through the town council. If I file as the potential property owner, which I am, if my bid is registered, I can request the inspection independently. The silence stretched between them. You've been thinking about this longer than tonight, Clara said. I've been thinking about this since the first notice, Mason said quietly. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to feel like I was running your battle for you. It's your home, Miss Clara. Your children. I wanted to give you the chance to fight it the way you needed to fight it before I stepped in with something bigger. Clara felt the breath go out of her. She had spent 8 years fighting alone because fighting alone was the only option she'd had. Not because she preferred it, not because she was too proud to accept help. Because there had never been anyone who understood that the fight belonged to her and still wanted to stand in it beside her. Mason, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. And she meant it the way people mean things when the words cost them something, not as courtesy, but as the honest expression of a feeling too important to leave unsaid. He nodded once. The brown eyes were steady. We've got 10 days, he said. Let's not waste them. They didn't. The next 72 hours were the most relentless of Clara's life, and she had lived a life that had not been gentle with her time. Mason rode to Helena and back in a single brutal day, pushing his horse harder than he liked, filing the bid registration that made him the official opposing purchaser and triggering his right to request the county inspection. He also, somewhere in the chaos of that day, managed to locate a telegram address for Judge Patterson in the county seat and send a message explaining the license situation in terms that were factually precise and legally sound, and Clara suspected from the response that arrived the following morning, also morally persuasive in the particular way that Mason Calloway communicated things he cared about, without embellishment, without manipulation, with a plainness that made the truth of the situation entirely visible. Patterson's letter arrived by courier the following afternoon. It was a formal letter of support for the Whitmore Orphan Home's license renewal, written on judicial letterhead and signed in ink that looked like it meant business. One letter, they needed 2. Clara sat with the problem for half an hour. Then Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway, with a look on his face that meant he had been listening to the adults talk more than they realized, which was a habit of his that Clara usually gently discouraged, but had stopped worrying about over the past week because the situation was beyond the point of being managed neatly. The pastor in Billings, Noah said, the one who helped Bess and May when the typhoid hit their town. He wrote you a letter 2 years ago about the work you were doing. You said he was a good man. Clara stared at Noah. Noah looked back at her with the absolute steadiness of a 16-year-old who had learned to trust his own thinking and was prepared to defend it. Pastor Elias Drummond, Clara said slowly. He's affiliated with the Baptist Conference. That's a church appointment. Yes, ma'am, Noah said. That might work, Mason said from behind Clara, and she turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway with a look on his face that was something between impressed and deeply pleased, directed entirely at Noah. Noah stood a little straighter. Worth trying, he said, in the tone of a boy who was learning. From the man standing in the doorway, that worth trying was enough reason to do most things. The telegram to Pastor Drummond went out that afternoon. His letter of support arrived 4 days later, faster than anyone had a right to expect, accompanied by a handwritten note that said simply, I remember those children. Whatever you need, ED2 letters filed. The county health officer arrived for the inspection on a Tuesday morning, and Clara had spent the previous 3 days making the orphan home as clean and well-ordered as 12 children and 2 determined adults could make it, which turned out to be impressively clean and well-ordered. The health officer, a precise man named Grover, who appeared to have expected a chaotic disaster and was visibly recalibrating his expectations within the first 5 minutes, walked through every room with his clipboard and his meticulous professional attention, and he asked Clara questions and she answered them. And he looked at the clean beds and the stocked kitchen and the repaired windows and the newly solid backstep and made notes. At the end of 2 hours, he closed his clipboard. "This is a well-run facility," he said in the tone of a man who gives this assessment rarely and means it when he does. Clara kept her voice even. "Thank you. The renewal paperwork will be processed within 5 days," he said. "The license will be reinstated as of current date." He left. Clara stood in the main room for a moment alone. Then she sat down in the nearest chair and pressed both hands over her face. She did not cry. She was not, fundamentally, a woman who cried in moments of relief, because relief had a way of undoing the careful structure that had been holding everything together, and she needed the structure to stay intact for at least a few more weeks. But she let herself have the 30 seconds of the hands over the face, the breathing, the small private acknowledgement that they had made it through one impossible thing. Just one. There were still more coming, she knew that. The town meeting was in 3 days, and Caldwell would be there, and the auction was still in front of them, and none of it was over. She took her hands from her face. She got up. She went to find Mason to tell him the inspection was done. And she found him in the yard with Lily on his shoulders. Lily, who had apparently decided that this was the appropriate mode of transportation for a Tuesday, and was wearing an expression of magnificent satisfaction. And Mason was talking to Noah about something with the easy, focused quality he brought to everything, and for a moment Clara just stood in the doorway and watched the 3 of them and felt the full weight of what was actually happening here. Beneath all the legal fights and paperwork and strategic maneuvering, something was being built, not just a defense of a property. Something that looked, in the afternoon light of a Tuesday in October, remarkably like a family. She stepped out into the yard. "License is done," she said. Mason looked at her. The expression on his face was not celebration exactly. It was something quieter and more solid than celebration, the look of a man who had committed to a fight and received confirmation that the ground under his feet was still holding. "Good," he said. "One thing at a time," Clarissa said. "One thing at a time," he agreed. Lily leaned down from her position on Mason's shoulders and looked at Clara with the solemn authority of a 4-year-old who has weighed a situation and reached her verdict. "Is the bad man going to go away?" she asked. Clara looked up at her. Then she looked at Mason. Then she looked back at Lily. And she said, with all the honesty she had, "We're doing everything we can to make sure he does." Lily considered this. She said, "I believe you." And that, Clara thought, climbing back to her feet, with the weight of the fight still ahead, was the most important thing any of them had said all week. The town meeting was held on a Tuesday night in the Harland Creek Assembly Hall, and by the time Clara arrived, every seat was taken. She had not expected that. She had expected the usual crowd, the council members, a handful of merchants, the men, who showed up to every meeting, because showing up was part of how they maintained their sense of importance in a small town. Maybe 40 people on a good night. There were at least 90 people in that room. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment and took the measure of it. She saw Ada Greer in the 3rd row with her hands folded in her lap and her expression set like a woman who has decided exactly how this evening is going to go. She saw Hannah Reeves and her husband near the wall, Hannah's jaw tight with the particular tension of a woman preparing to do something that costs her something. She counted women she recognized 20, 22, more sitting beside husbands who looked, in varying degrees, like men who had been told certain things over supper that week and were still processing them. She saw Everett Caldwell in the front row. He had brought 2 of his lawyers. They sat with the relaxed confidence of men who had already won and were simply waiting for the formalities to complete themselves. Mason was at the back of the room when Clara found him, standing with his arms crossed and his hat on, watching the front with the focused calm she'd come to recognize as his particular version of ready. "More than we expected," she said quietly. "Ada Greer has been busy," he said. "I passed her at the Mercantile yesterday, and she had a look on her face like a general before a battle. She's been talking to every woman in a 30-mile radius." "I know," he paused. "Caldwell's lawyers came prepared. I recognize the one on the left. He handled a land dispute in Billings 2 years ago. He's sharp." Clara looked at the front row. "Are we ready?" she said. Mason looked at her. "Are you?" he said. She straightened her spine. "I've been ready for 30 days, she said. Chairman Holt called the meeting to order with the particular nervousness of a man standing between two opposing forces and hoping very much not to be caught in the crossfire. He worked through the preliminary business with unusual speed, his eyes moving between Caldwell's corner and the packed rows of women with the expression of a man counting exits. Then he cleared his throat and said, "The primary item on this evening's agenda is the proposed commercial acquisition of the property currently operating as the Whitmore Orphan Home." Caldwell's lawyer stood up immediately. He was a compact man in an expensive coat, and he spoke with the smooth velocity of someone who had rehearsed this presentation several times and was confident in its effect. He laid out the business case with precision and efficiency, the economic benefit to the region, the jobs the trading station would create, the tax revenue that would flow to the town, the fact that the children could be redistributed to county facilities in Helena and Billings that were, he said carefully, better equipped to provide comprehensive care. He said redistributed. Clara felt the word land in the room like a stone dropped in still water. She watched the women's faces. She watched Ada Greer's jaw tighten. She watched Hannah Reeves take a slow breath through her nose. Redistributed. Like inventory. Holt opened the floor. Ada Greer stood up before he had finished the sentence. "I've lived in Harlan Creek for 31 years, Ada said, in the carrying voice of a woman who had never once in her life needed to raise it to be heard. I have watched this town grow from 12 buildings and a creek crossing into something I'm genuinely proud of. And I will tell you what I am not proud of, and what I will not sit quietly in this room and let happen without saying so in front of every man who lives here." She paused. "I am not proud of the idea that we would sell the ground out from under 12 children who have already been abandoned by the world once, so that Everett Caldwell can collect trading fees." The room was very quiet. Caldwell in the front row turned to look at Ada with an expression of polite patience that was so practiced it looked almost real. Ada sat down. Hannah Reeves stood up, then Margaret Pruitt, the schoolteacher. Then Beth Callum, the postmaster's wife. Then a woman Clara didn't recognize by name, who said only that she'd lost her own children years ago, and that the Whitmore home was the first place she'd been able to send food without feeling like it didn't matter, and that it mattered. And that mattered to her more than any trading station ever would. Woman after woman, the room's temperature was changing. Clara could feel it, the shift in the air that happens when a moral argument stops being abstract and starts being made by the people in the room who are actually living it. The men around the hall were doing the particular social calculation that men in public settings do when the women beside them are speaking about something that costs those women something, measuring what it means to be sitting next to someone. Making this argument, measuring what it costs to agree, measuring what it costs not to. Caldwell's lawyer stood up again after the seventh woman had spoken. "We appreciate the community's passion," he said, with a smoothness that was itself a kind of insult. "But the legal and commercial realities of this transaction are not affected by personal sentiment. The property transaction is lawful, the timeline is lawful, and the county facility provisions for the children are adequate, and the children have names." The voice came from the back of the room. Mason Calloway. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. He didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice beyond the level that carried cleanly to every corner of the room. He just said it, flat and clear, and the room went absolutely silent. "Their names are Lily, and Noah, and James, and Dora, and Bess, and May, and Henry, and Ruth and Cal, and Josephine, and Daniel, and Grace, Mason said. They are not county facility provisions. They are children who sleep in those beds every night and wake up in that house every morning and have been building a life in that place for years. And I will tell you something else. He paused. The lawyers were looking at him. Caldwell was looking at him. Everyone in the room was looking at him. I have registered a formal bid for that property through the Helena Land Office, Mason said. A counterbid filed legally, which means this transaction does not proceed by private arrangement. It goes to public auction, and at that auction I will be there. Caldwell's lawyer turned to his colleague and said something quiet. Caldwell himself had not changed his expression. He was looking at Mason with the calculating steadiness of a man reassessing a situation he thought he had fully mapped and discovering an element he had not accounted for. Holt looked as though he wanted very much to be somewhere else. Mr. Calloway, Caldwell said. His voice was pleasant. I understand your attachment to the cause, but you're a rancher. A hard-working man, I respect that. Do you really want to put your financial security at risk over a piece of land you have no practical use for? The room waited. Mason looked at Caldwell for a long moment. I reckon, he said, that what I have practical use for is my own business. Several things happened in the next 20 minutes that Clara watched from her seat with the focused attention of a woman who knows she is witnessing something that matters. 3 of the men in the room, men she knew to be independent-minded, men who had not been sufficiently in Caldwell's orbit to be obligated to him, stood up and spoke in support of the orphan home. Not emotionally, not with the passion of the women, but with the flat practical language of men saying publicly that they thought it was wrong, and that they wanted it on record that they thought it was wrong. It was not nothing. It was not enough to stop the auction. But it was not nothing. When the meeting ended and the room began to empty, Clara found herself standing near the door when Everett Caldwell walked past her. He stopped. He was close enough that she could see the careful calculation in his pale eyes, the look of a man who had been inconvenienced but was not frightened, who was adjusting his tactics but not reconsidering his objective. Whitmore, he said pleasantly, you've built something admirable here. Truly, I hope you understand that this isn't personal. Clara looked at him. It's personal to 12 children, she said. He smiled a professional smile, the kind that doesn't reach anything behind it. They'll land on their feet, he said. Children are resilient. Clara held his gaze. Children are resilient, she said, because the adults around them choose to be. Good evening, Mr. Caldwell. She walked out. Mason was waiting outside. He's not scared, Clara said. No, Mason agreed. He's not. He's recalibrating. There's a difference. What does recalibrating mean for us? It means he's going to move faster. He's going to put pressure somewhere we haven't anticipated. Mason pulled his coat tighter against the night cold. He's going to try to get to me directly. Through your ranch? Through my business relationships, the men I sell cattle to. The grazing lease arrangement I have with the Morrison land to the north. Caldwell has connections I don't have full visibility on. He paused. I want you to be ready for the fact that things might get harder before the auction. Clara looked at him in the dark. I have been ready for things to get harder every day of the last 8 years, she said. That part doesn't scare me. He looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. And the way he said it simple, sure, without any trace of the patronizing comfort she was used to receiving from people who meant well, made her feel, for the first time in 30 days, like she was being seen exactly as she was. Not as someone who needed protection, as someone who was capable of choosing her own battles and bearing their cost. She was not prepared for how much that felt like something she'd been waiting for. She walked home. She did not look back. She should have. Because 2 days later, at 6 in the morning, Noah came downstairs and found her already at the table with a letter in her hands and an expression on her face that she had not managed to compose before he saw it. He stopped. What is it? He said. Clara set the letter on the table. Sit down, Noah. He sat. The letter was from the Morrison family, specifically from Gerald Morrison's eldest son, who now managed the Morrison land north of Mason's ranch. It informed Mason that the grazing lease arrangement currently in effect would not be renewed at the end of the current season, effective in 30 days, citing a change in the Morrison land's operational priorities. Clara had found it on the step that morning, slipped under the door, left by someone who must have ridden out from the Morrison property before dawn. 30 days, the same timeline as the orphan home. Noah read the letter. "This is Caldwell," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "He got to the Morrisons. He's been busy," Clara said quietly. "That grazing lease is Mason uses that land for a significant portion of his summer cattle operation. Losing it changes his financial picture considerably." Noah was very still. It was addressed to him. "I think they delivered it here because they knew he'd be coming this morning." She looked at Noah. "He'll be here in an hour." Noah looked at the letter. Then he looked at Clara. "He's still going to do it," Noah said. "He's still going to bid. You know that." Clara said nothing. "You're going to try to talk him out of it," Noah said. Clara pressed her lips together. "I'm going to make sure he understands what it costs," she said. "He deserves to make that decision with full information." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular precision of a 16-year-old who has thought something through completely, "Miss Clara, I want to say something, and I want you to really hear it." She looked at him. "Every adult who was ever supposed to choose us didn't," Noah said. "My father left before I was born. My mother died when I was 9. Every placement before here, every one of them, just decided we were too much trouble, or too expensive, or just not worth the difficulty." He paused. "Mason Calloway has been showing up here every single day for a month, and he has never once made any of us feel like we were something he was tolerating. He fixed the fence and the windows and the roof, and he reads to Lily every night, and he worked on that trough with me all afternoon without once making me feel like a charity case." He paused again. "If he wants to fight for us, Miss Clara, let him fight. Don't take that away from him." Clara stared at the table. She had been so focused on protecting the children from attachment, from the specific devastation of believing in an adult, and then losing them, that she had not considered the other side of it. That refusing to let someone fight for you was also a kind of taking. That Noah, at 16, had just articulated something she'd spent 8 years getting wrong. "When did you get so wise?" she said. Noah looked slightly embarrassed. "I listen," he said simply. "Mason arrived at 7:15. He saw the letter on the table as soon as he walked in. He read it standing up." Clara watched his face, the jaw, the slight compression around his eyes, the stillness that moved through him when he was absorbing something serious. "He set the letter down," he said. "Yes," Clara said. He was quiet. "Mason," Clara said carefully, "this changes your financial position in a way." "I know what it changes," he said. "Then you understand that the bid, combined with the loss of the Morrison lease." Clara, his voice was level, not sharp, just absolutely certain. "I know what it costs. I did the numbers as last night before this letter arrived, because I had a feeling something like this was coming. I know what I'm walking into." "Then why?" she said. Not challenging him, genuinely asking. "You have a ranch. You have a life you built. These children aren't your responsibility." Mason looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "They're not my responsibility." He picked up his coffee cup. "They're my choice." The room held that for a moment. Then Noah, from the doorway where he'd been standing quietly, said, "Thank you, sir," in a voice that was trying to be steady and almost was, and Mason looked at the boy and nodded once, and that was all that needed to happen. 3 days before the auction, Caldwell made his final move. Clara had expected pressure on Mason. She had expected legal maneuvering. What she had not expected was the visit from a county official named Pearson, who arrived at the orphan home on a Friday afternoon with a sheaf of papers and the look of a man following orders he personally found distasteful. Pearson worked for the county assessor's office. He explained, received a formal inquiry regarding the valuation of the orphan home property. A reassessment had been requested. and preliminary calculations suggested the property had been significantly undervalued in its previous assessment, which meant the purchase price at auction would be set considerably higher than the number Clara had given Mason. Clara stared at Pearson. "How much higher?" she said. He told her. The number was nearly 40% above the previous assessment. Clara sat down. She didn't mean to. Her body made the decision before her mind did, lowering her into the kitchen chair with the heaviness of someone who has absorbed one too many blows in close succession. Pearson was talking something about the appeals process, something about timeline, but she wasn't fully hearing it. She was doing the mathematics that she was certain Mason had already done, and she was arriving at the same answer, which was that at 40% above the previous figure, the purchase would require Mason to liquidate not just the Morrison lease but a portion of the ranch's operating capital that would leave him vulnerable through the winter season. Pearson left. Clara sat at the table for a long time. When Mason arrived that evening and she told him, he didn't sit down. He stood in the kitchen with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes doing the arithmetic in his head that she had already done in hers. And the silence was the specific kind that exists when two people are in the same terrible numerical reality, and both of them know it. "I can cover it," he said finally. "At what cost?" Clara said. "I'll sell the Morrison grazing rights outright, rather than leasing them back. I have a timber agreement with a company in Billings that I can liquidate for immediate capital. And I have a bond from the Helena Bank I can call early with a penalty." "Mason, I can cover it, Clara. You'll be exposing the ranch." "I know what I'll be exposing it to." He looked at her. "I know exactly what I'll be exposing it to. I made those calculations 3 times this week because I wanted to be absolutely certain of the number before I stood in front of you and said it." He paused. "It leaves me with less margin than I'd like, but the ranch stays. The cattle operation stays. It'll be a harder few years than I planned for. But I have been through harder." Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. "This is too much," she said. "This is too much to ask." "You didn't ask," he said quietly. "That's exactly the point." She looked up at him. His eyes were completely steady. "You have spent 8 years asking nothing from anyone," he said. "You have carried 12 children on a back that was strong enough to hold them, and you have fought every fight alone. And you have never once in all the time I've been coming to this house suggested that you expected anything from me beyond what I offered. You didn't ask me to come. You didn't ask me to bid. You didn't ask me to cover the reassessment." He paused. "I am doing this because it is the right thing to do, and because those children deserve someone who does the right thing without needing to be asked, and because minus." He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet because, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then Mason Calloway, who chose his words the way a careful man chooses his steps in uncertain terrain, said, "Because this place has become the most important thing in my life. And the people in it." Clara felt something move through her that had no simple name, not relief, not gratitude, not the feeling she'd been refusing to examine since the evening he'd carried Lily to bed. Something larger than all of those things, and older than any of them. Something that felt, if she was honest, like the recognition of something she hadn't known she was looking for, until it was standing in her kitchen, telling her it intended to stay. She didn't say anything. She couldn't quite. But she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the thing between them that had been building since that first morning at the feed store stood fully in the room with them now, visible and serious, and neither of them pretending otherwise. "The auction is in 3 days," Mason said finally. His voice was quieter than usual. "I know," Clara said. "Whatever happens," he started. "Whatever happens," Clara said, "you have already done more for these children than anyone has done in 8 years. Whatever happens at that auction," he nodded slowly. He reached for his hat, and then the back door burst open and Noah came in at a run. Noah, who never ran. Who had the deliberate economy of motion of a boy who had decided that dignity required measured pace, and his face was carrying something Clara had never seen there before. Urgency, real urgency, the kind that overrides everything. What Clara started. "It's James," Noah said. "He's hurt." The next 10 minutes were the fastest and most terrifying of Clara's week, and her week had already contained a great deal of competition for that position. James was 11 years old and had spent the better part of the month attempting to understand the mechanics of the barn's old hay pulley, which was exactly the kind of mechanical puzzle that his particular mind found irresistible, and which Clara had asked him 3 times to leave alone until Mason could look at it properly. He had not left it alone. The rope had given way. He hadn't fallen far 8, maybe 9 feet, and he'd landed on the hay pile below, which had absorbed the worst of it. But he'd come down wrong on his left arm, and the angle of it when Noah brought him inside told Clara everything she needed to know. Mason was already moving. He went straight to James with the focused efficiency of a man who had dealt with ranch injuries and knew exactly what needed doing and in what order. He spoke to James in a calm, direct voice that immediately cut through the boy's panicked, crying, not dismissing it, just steadying it, giving James something certain to hold on to while Mason assessed the arm. "You're all right," Mason said. "Look at me, right here." "You're all right." James looked at him. He was shaking. "Does it hurt here?" Pressed gently. "Yes, sir," James managed. "Here, yes, sir. Can you feel my hand?" "Yes, sir." "All right." Mason leaned back. "It's broken, Clara." "Clean break, I think. We need Dr. Hartley." Noah was already at the door. "I'll get him," he said. He was gone before anyone said another word. Clara sat with James while Mason went to the kitchen and came back with strips of clean cloth and a short flat board from the woodpile, and he made a splint with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. No wasted motion, no drama, just steady, careful work while James gripped Clara's hand hard enough to leave marks. "You scared me," Clara said to James quietly while Mason worked. James looked at her with wet eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just wanted to understand how it worked." "I know," she said. "Was it real bad?" "Bad enough," Clara said. "Good enough outcome." Or James looked at, he asked. Mason tied the last strip. "Not at you," he said. "At the rope, maybe. That pulley needed replacing 6 years ago." He met James's eyes. "This is on me for not fixing it sooner." James stared at him. He had been bracing for anger. Clara could see it, the way children who have been in difficult circumstances brace for the response they've learned to expect. And instead, he'd gotten a man accepting responsibility for something that was arguably not his responsibility to accept, simply because it was the true and honest thing. James swallowed hard. "Thank you," he said. "Thank me by leaving that barn equipment alone until I show you how it works proper," Mason said. "Which I will. Soon as that arm heals." James's face. "You'll show me," he said. "All of it, Mason." "Every piece, so you understand it right." James nodded. And through his pain and his exhaustion and his wet-cheeked relief, something settled in him that Clara recognized because she'd seen it happen with each of the children at different over the years, the settling that happens when a child stops waiting for a thing and starts believing in it. Dr. Hartley arrived 40 minutes later, confirmed the clean break, set and wrapped the arm properly, left instructions, and departed with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen enough ranch country injuries to take this one in stride. The house settled slowly back into its evening routine. The children were quieter than usual, the way children go quiet after a fright, the energy folding inward. Lily had found James on the parlor bench and installed herself next to him, with her cloth rabbit pressed against his good arm, her expression indicating she intended to remain there for as long as the situation required. After the children were in bed, Mason and Clara sat at the kitchen table for the last time before the auction. 3 days. "He's going to make a scene at the auction," Clara said. "Caldwell." "Yes," Mason said. "He's going to make it about business versus sentimentality. He's going to make it about the town's economic future versus a woman who couldn't manage her paperwork, and a rancher who made an emotional decision." "Yes," Mason said again, "and some people in that room are going to agree with him." "Some will." He looked at her. "Not enough." Clara looked down at the table. "How do you know?" "Because tonight," Mason said, 22 women showed up at a public meeting and said 12 children's names out loud in front of every man in this town. And tonight a 16-year-old boy ran for the doctor before anyone asked him to. And tonight a man who barely talks told an 11-year-old boy that the broken equipment was his fault, and meant it, because that's the kind of person he is becoming in this place. He paused. Caldwell has money and lawyers and a business plan. We have something he doesn't know how to price. Clara looked at him. What's that, she said. People who show up, Mason said simply. When it matters. The auction was in 3 days, and Everett Caldwell had no idea what was walking into that room. The morning of the auction, Clara woke before 4. She lay in the dark for exactly 60 seconds, listening to the house breathe around her the small sounds of 12 sleeping children, the creak of the building, settling against the October cold, the wind moving outside, and then she got up. She did not allow herself to lie there building scenarios in her mind, because she had learned over 8 years that the mind unchecked in the dark before dawn will construct the worst possible version of every outcome with a creativity that serves no practical purpose. She got up. She built the fire. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the cup, and she thought about exactly one thing. Not the auction, not Caldwell, not the money, or the lawyers, or the reassessment, or the 30 days that had become today. She thought about the morning she had found the eviction notice nailed to her door. The way her hands had shaken, the way she had stood on that step in her gray dress and read it 3 times and then gone inside and made breakfast without telling a single child what she was carrying. She had believed that morning that she was going to lose. Not because she wasn't willing to fight. She had always been willing to fight. But because she had been fighting alone for so long that she had quietly, privately, without ever saying it aloud, stopped believing that alone was enough. The fight had been getting harder, every year the money tighter, the donations smaller, the children's needs larger, the weight of it accumulated across 8 years until it had the specific density of something that might finally be too heavy. And then a man had come to fix a fence. Clara looked at the fire. She didn't know yet what was going to happen today. She didn't know if Mason's bid would hold, or if Caldwell had another angle she hadn't seen, or if the number they'd calculated was enough. She didn't know if this day ended with 12 children safe in their beds, or with the beginning of something too terrible to think about clearly. What she knew was that she was not walking into that auction alone. And she had not understood until 30 days ago how much that mattered. She heard footsteps on the stairs at 5:30, and she expected Noah, who was always first up, who had the internal clock of a person who had learned early that mornings belonged to the prepared. But it was Lily who appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair at its customary catastrophic angle, clutching her cloth rabbit with one hand and rubbing her eye with the other. "Why are you up?" "I had a dream," Lily said. "What kind?" Lily came to the table and climbed into the chair beside Clara with the focused determination of a 4-year-old negotiating furniture. "The bad man came and took the house," she said simply. "And everybody had to go somewhere different." Clara set down her cup. She opened her arms. Lily climbed into her lap without hesitation and settled against her with the total physical trust of a small child who has decided that this is the safest place and is not interested in arguments to the contrary. "That was just a dream," Clara said. "Is today the day?" Lily said. "Yes." "Is the firewood man going to be there?" "Yes." Lily was quiet for a moment, her rabbit pressed under her chin. "He won't let them take it," she said. Not a question. A statement. Delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who has evaluated the available evidence and reached her conclusion. Clara held her tighter. "We're going to do everything we can," she said. "That's what you said before," Lily said. "And things worked out." "Things worked out," Clara agreed. "So they'll work out today," Lily said, with the flawless logical confidence of 4 years old, and she closed her eyes against Clara's shoulder and was asleep again within 3 minutes, as if the matter were fully settled. Clara held her in the firelight and thought about what it meant to believe in something without reservation. Without calculation, without the accumulated scar tissue of every time belief had cost you something. She thought she had forgotten how to do that. Maybe she was learning it again. Mason arrived at 7. He knocked once and came in when Clara called. And he was dressed with the particular care of a man who understood that how you present yourself in a room where decisions are being made is not vanity, but strategy, good coat, clean boots, hat in hand. He looked at Clara across the kitchen, and she looked at him, and neither of them said good morning or asked how the other was doing, because those questions belonged to ordinary days, and this was not an ordinary day. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. Noah appeared at the foot of the stairs with his own coat on. "I'm coming," he said. Clara opened her mouth. "No," Noah said before she could speak. "I'm 16 years old. I have the right to be there." He paused. "And somebody should be there who those children know. So when it's over, they hear it from someone who was in the room." Clara looked at him. She thought about the boy who had shown up at the orphan home 3 years ago, 9 stone of silence and suspicion, who had not smiled for the first 4 months and had watched every adult with the careful measuring eyes of someone taking inventory of the ways they might eventually fail him. She thought about the boy who had run for the doctor without being asked, who had held lumber steady on a roof for 2 hours without a word, who had said, with the flat honesty of someone who has earned the right to speak, "Let him fight." "All right," she said. He nodded once, exactly the way Mason nodded, and she thought, well. There it is. The 3 of them walked to the auction together. The auction was held at the courthouse, which was the largest indoor space in Harlan Creek, capable of handling the crowd that had assembled by 9 o'clock in the morning. Clara had not expected the crowd. She had expected the principal's Caldwell, his lawyers, Mason's attorney from Helena, who had ridden in the previous afternoon, the county clerk who would oversee the proceeding, a handful of witnesses. What she found was every person in Harlan Creek who could get out of bed and walk. Ada Greer was there with 6 of the women from the town meeting. Hannah Reeves, the schoolteacher, the postmaster's wife. 3 men who had stood up at the town meeting were there. Reverend Alcott was in the back, which surprised Clara until she looked at his face and saw the expression of a man who had made a decision he should have made earlier and was here to be counted late rather than not at all. And Caldwell. He was at the front with both lawyers and a third man. Clara didn't recognize someone from Helena, she guessed, from the quality of his coat and the way he moved through the room with the confidence of someone who was not accustomed to this particular kind of gathering and found it mildly beneath him. Caldwell saw Mason. His expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man who had genuinely been surprised would have registered it. Caldwell's face simply recalibrated, a slight tightening at the corners of his eyes, the smallest compression of his mouth, and then resettled into pleasantness. He had known Mason was coming. He had planned for it. Clara felt the cold of that. What he hadn't planned for was what happened when the crowd settled, and the county clerk, a thin, precise man named Walsh, called the proceeding to order. Before Walsh had finished his opening formalities, Caldwell's lead lawyer stood up and said, "We'd like to raise a preliminary matter before the bidding opens." Walsh looked up from his papers. "Go ahead. It has come to our attention," the lawyer said, in the smooth, unhurried voice Clara had heard at the town meeting, that Mr. Mason Calloway, the registered counterbidder in this proceeding, currently holds outstanding liens against his ranch property in connection with a capital loan from the Helena Territorial Bank, dated March of this year. We are filing a motion to question the validity of his bid on the grounds that a bidder with outstanding liens against existing property may not legally secure additional real property acquisition in excess of. That lien was discharged, Mason's attorney said. He was a compact, fast-moving man named Aldridge, who had driven through the night from Helena and looked like a person who had not slept but was running entirely on precision and purpose. "Discharged when?" Caldwell's lawyer asked. "Yesterday morning," Aldridge said. "At 11:42 Helena time. I have the documentation." He placed a document on the clerk's table. Caldwell's lawyer picked it up. "Read it," placed it back down with a control that Clara recognized as the practiced composure of a man absorbing a setback he had not anticipated. The room had gone very quiet. Walsh examined the document. "The lien discharge appears valid," he said. "The motion is denied. We'll proceed to bidding." Clara heard Ada Greer exhale 2 rows behind her. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the front of the room, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. The bidding opened at the reassessed figure. Caldwell's lawyer entered his client's opening bid, a number slightly above the floor, delivered with the confidence of a man who expects to be the only serious participant and is simply completing a formality. Aldridge entered Mason's counterbid. It was higher. Caldwell's lawyer raised. Aldridge raised. The room had the particular breathless quality of a place where everyone is watching something they understand is consequential but can do nothing about the complexities of people who have aligned themselves with an outcome and can only witness. Clara's hands were pressed flat on her knees. Beside her, Noah was completely motionless, watching the front of the room with the focused attention he'd given Mason on that first afternoon on the barn roof, reading it, measuring it, not flinching. The bids went up in measured increments. 3 rounds. 4. 5. On the 6th round, Caldwell's lawyer raised by a number that was significantly larger than the previous increments, a jump designed to test the limits of Mason's position, to find the ceiling of what he could sustain. The room waited. Aldridge leaned to Mason, spoke in undertones for 30 seconds. The room waited. Mason straightened. Aldridge entered the counterbid. It held. Caldwell's lawyer turned to Caldwell and spoke quietly. Caldwell's expression was controlled, but Clara, watching him with the attention she'd developed over a month of studying what this man's face did when things didn't go as planned, could see at the specific tightness of a person who has reached the edge of the calculation they had run in advance and is now operating with the security of a predetermined answer. He raised again, smaller increment this time. Aldridge counterbid. Another pause. Another raise from Caldwell. And then something happened that Clara had not planned for and had not expected, and that would later become the part of the story she returned to most often when she needed to remember what it looked like, when a community decided to be what it was supposed to be. Gerald Morrison stood up. Gerald Morrison was 62 years old, had lived on his land north of Mason's ranch for 30 years, and had, through his son's letter, been the instrument of one of Caldwell's most effective blows against Mason's financial position. He was a big, slow-moving man with the particular gravity of someone who has spent decades making decisions about land and weather and livestock and has developed a very clear internal sense of what things are actually worth. He stood up and he said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to being heard across open terrain, "I want to say something before this goes further." Walsh looked up. "Mr. Morrison, this is an auction proceeding." "I know what it is," Morrison said, "and I know what I did. My son sent that letter on my behalf without telling me the full nature of the situation. When I found out this week that Caldwell's people had approached him to cancel Calloway's lease, I wanted on the record that I did not authorize that. And I wanted on the record that Mason Calloway's lease on my north grazing land stands. It is not canceled. My son acted without full authority." The room went absolutely still. Caldwell turned slowly to look at Morrison. Morrison looked back at him with the entirely unimpressed expression of a man who has been farming for 30 years and is not intimidated by expensive coats. "We'll sort out the details after," Morrison said to Mason. "But I wanted you to know, before it mattered too much not to." Mason looked at him. "Much obliged," he said. 2 words. The full weight of them. Morrison sat down. Clara felt something move through the room, not just in her, but through the collective body of every person sitting in that hall. The shift that happens when a private decision becomes a public one. When someone does the right thing not in the dark where it's easy, but in the light where it costs something. Caldwell's lawyer raised his bid again. It was reflexive now. Clara could see it. The strategy had been to isolate Mason financially and outlast him. Morrison's statement had just restored the ground under Mason's feet in a way that Caldwell's calculation hadn't hid for, and the lawyer was operating on momentum rather than on a revised plan. Aldridge raised, Caldwell raised, Aldridge raised. And then Caldwell's lawyer stopped. He leaned to his client. They spoke for almost a full minute, the longest pause of the proceeding, while the room held its collective breath, and Clara gripped her own hands in her lap, hard enough to leave marks. Caldwell straightened. He looked at Mason across the room. And he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to everyone, but Clara was close enough to hear it, "You're making a mistake, Calloway." Mason said, "I'm making a choice." "There's a difference." Caldwell looked at him for one more moment. Then he turned to his lawyer and said something short and final. The lawyer did not raise. Walsh waited the required interval. "Called once, sold," he said, "to Mason Calloway." The room erupted, not in the polished celebration of a formal proceeding. In the raw, uncontrolled release of people who have been holding their breath for a very long time. Ada Greer's voice, Hannah Reeves grabbing her husband's arm, the schoolteacher pressing both hands to her mouth. The men who had stood up at the town meeting, turning to each other with the expressions of people who have witnessed something they will be telling their grandchildren about. Clara did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the front of the room where Walsh was completing the paperwork, and Aldridge was moving briskly through the finalization process. And she felt the enormity of what had just happened move through her in a slow wave, not celebration, not relief exactly, but something deeper and quieter than both. The feeling of a load that has been carried so long you've forgotten what your own spine feels like without it, suddenly and completely set down. Noah made a sound beside her. She looked at him. He was looking at the front of the room with his jaw tight and his eyes bright. And she watched him manage it, watched him do the 16-year-old thing of pulling the feeling back behind the controlled surface he'd been building for years as protection. She put her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. They walked out of the courthouse into the October morning, the three of them, and they stood on the steps while the crowd moved around them. And Ada Greer came directly to Clara and took both her hands and looked at her with eyes that had seen 31 years of this town and said, simply and completely, "It's done." "It's done," Clara said. She looked at Mason. He was standing slightly apart, talking to Aldridge in the quiet, efficient shorthand of a man completing necessary business, and she watched his profile, the jaw, the steadiness of him. The way he stood in the aftermath of something enormous with the same groundedness he'd brought fixing the fence that first morning, and she thought about what he had said the evening before the auction. People who show up when it matters. Caldwell left without speaking to anyone. His lawyers followed, the third man from Helena. They moved through the crowd and into the street with the particular silence of people who have lost something they were certain they would win, and Clara watched them go, without satisfaction and without pity. Just acknowledgement, the shape of a thing that was over. Morrison stopped beside Mason on his way out. The two men stood together for a moment. Morrison said something low that Clara couldn't hear. Mason nodded once. Morrison extended his hand. Mason took it. That was all. It was enough. They walked back to the orphan home. The children were at school, all except James, whose arm required another day of rest, and Lily, who was 4 and not yet enrolled, and who had been left in the care of the oldest girl, 15-year-old Grace, who was entirely capable and had been told by Clara before they left that morning that she was in charge, and that this was not a statement made lightly. Lily heard them on the step. She was at the door before they had it fully open, and she looked at the three of them in sequence: Clara, then Noah, then Mason, with the systematic assessment of someone who has learned to read adult faces for the news before the words arrive. "Did the bad man go away?" she said. "Yes," Mason said. Lily looked at him for one more second to confirm. Then she grabbed his hand with both of hers and said, "Good," with the finality of a door closing on something that was finished. Grace appeared behind her with the more restrained but equally genuine relief of a 15-year-old who understood more than she was supposed to. "Is it real?" For certain, Clara said. Grace closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "All right," she said. She turned around. "Lily, come help me with the bread." Lily kept hold of Mason's hand. "Lily," Grace said in her best approximation of Clara's tone. Lily released Mason's hand with the expression of someone making a significant concession and followed Grace to the kitchen. Mason was still standing in the doorway. Clara was across the room, and she turned to look at him, And the house was quiet around them for the first time in 30 days, not the brittle quiet of a fight being held together, but the honest quiet of something that had been resolved. "Come sit down," she said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, where he had sat every evening for a month, where they had worked through every problem and every setback and every document and every impossible number. And he set his hat on the table and his hands around a coffee cup that Clara poured without asking, because she had stopped needing to ask what he wanted in this kitchen several weeks ago. Noah sat with them, and the three of them sat at the table in the quiet morning, and nobody said anything for a while, because some things have a weight to them that words disturb rather than honor. And all three of them understood that well enough to let the silence sit. Then Noah said, "What happens now?" It was a real question. Not rhetorical. The practical mind of a boy who had survived by thinking about what comes next. Mason looked at Clara. Clara looked at Mason. "I've been thinking about that," Mason said. He turned his cup in both hands. "The property is mine. But it was never meant to be mine, it was meant to be theirs. So I'd like to put the deed in a trust, a legal protection so that no one person owns it and no creditor can touch it and no future businessman with a land acquisition plan can get within a legal mile of it." He paused. "Aldridge can set it up. I've already talked to him about the framework." Clara stared at him. "When did you talk to him about that?" she said. 2 days ago, Mason said, "before the reassessment. Before the auction. I wanted to know if it was possible before I knew if we'd won." She was quiet. "You planned the whole thing," she said. "I planned what I could," he said. "I couldn't plan what Caldwell was going to do. I couldn't plan Morrison standing up. I couldn't plan any of the people who showed up today." He looked at his cup. "But the thing after the protection, that was something I could plan. So I did." Noah was looking at Mason with an expression Clara had never seen on the boy's face before. Not quite admiration, because admiration implied distance, and there was no distance in it. Something closer. Something that was working its way toward a name that Noah, at 16, might not have the language for yet, but would understand in his bones for the rest of his life. What it looked like when a man took care of people. Not as performance, not for recognition, but as the natural and necessary expression of who he was. "There's something else," Mason said. Clara looked at him. He set his cup down. He reached into his coat and placed a second document on the table. Clara looked at it. It was a deed, not the orphan home's deed, a different one. She leaned forward and read the top of it, and her breath stopped. It was the deed to a parcel of land adjacent to the orphan home property. 3 acres of good level ground, with a standing well and access to the creek. "The Hendricks parcel," Clara said. "Caldwell bought it from the Hendricks family in the spring," Mason said. "But he hadn't filed the development permits yet. When he lost the auction today, his business position in Harlan Creek becomes considerably less viable. I had Aldridge check whether he'd be willing to sell quickly at a reduced figure rather than hold a parcel with no strategic value." He paused. "He sold this morning, before the auction. Aldridge handled it by telegraph yesterday evening." Clara stared at the document. "You bought more land," she said. "The children need room to grow," Mason said simply. "The home is full. You've turned people away twice this year that you told me about, and I suspect there were others you didn't mention. 3 acres gives you space for a proper garden, a larger barn, and if you wanted to build an additional dormitory in the next few years." "Mason," Clara's voice was not entirely steady. "It's what needed doing," he said. "You can't just—" She stopped. Looked at the document, looked at him. "How much of your own security did you spend today?" He met her eyes. "Not too much. The ranch is sound. The Morrison lease is restored. The cattle operation will carry through the spring without difficulty." He paused. "I want you to know that. I'm not telling you this is nothing. It's not nothing. It's a harder few years than I planned for, but I've been living inside a plan that was designed for a life that ended 7 years ago, and I think I needed something to spend it on." The room held that. Noah was looking very carefully at the table. Clara looked at Mason across the table at this man who had come to fix a fence and had ended up dismantling and rebuilding the entire architecture of her life, and apparently his own in the process, and she felt the full weight of the past 30 days move through her at once. Not as grief, not as relief, as something else entirely. Something that felt like arriving somewhere after a very long road, when your feet finally know the ground is solid and you can stop watching every step. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said. "You already did," he said. 30 days ago, when you told 12 children's names in that kitchen and made me understand what I was looking at." The house was very quiet. Then Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with flour on both hands and Grace's exasperated voice behind her. And she looked at the three of them at the table and said with the certainty of a child who has decided everything is exactly as it should be, "Are you staying for lunch, Firewood Man?" Mason looked at her. He looked at Clara. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was every feeling that a smile is made of, and he said, "If there's enough." Lily's expression indicated that this question did not merit the asking. "There's always enough," she said, and went back to her flour. Clara looked at Mason, Mason looked at Clara, and in the kitchen of the Whitmore orphan home, on the morning that everything changed and everything was kept, they both understood, without saying it. Because some things are said more clearly without words, that the only thing harder than fighting alone was learning to accept that you didn't have to anymore. The lunch was enough, it was more than enough. Outside in the cold October air, Harlan Creek went about its business the way small towns do after something large has happened, with the particular mixture of relief and story building, and the gradual return to the ordinary that is how communities absorb events that are too significant to be processed all at once. But inside the orphan home, at the kitchen table, with flour on the counter and coffee in the cups and 12 names carved invisibly but permanently into every wall of the place they called home, something had settled that would not be unsettled. And none of them needed to say what it was, they already knew. The children came home from school that afternoon and found out the way children find out the best things all at once without preamble from someone who couldn't contain it. Noah was waiting at the gate. He had gone quiet at the courthouse, and quiet on the walk home, and quiet through the lunch. In the particular way he went quiet when he was holding something large inside himself and hadn't yet found the right container for it. But when he saw the older children coming up the road, James and Dora and Bess and May and Henry and Ruth and Cal and Josephine and Daniel and Grace, 10 of them in a loose cluster, with their coats of school slate, something in him simply gave way. He opened the gate, he said, "We won." 2 words. The cluster stopped walking. Dora said, "What?" Noah said. Mason bid higher. "Caldwell quit. It's done. The home is ours." There was a silence of approximately 2 seconds. Then Josephine, who was 13 and possessed of a voice that could carry across 3 open fields, made a sound that was not quite a word and launched herself at Noah with enough force that he had to take a step back to absorb it. Then Bess grabbed May's hand, and they were both crying and laughing at the same time, in the way twins do things simultaneously, completely, without self-consciousness. Then Henry, who was 10 and deeply committed to the idea that he was too old for emotional displays, put both fists in the air and said yes with a ferocity that contradicted every position he'd held on the subject. Then Daniel, who was 7, and hadn't fully understood the weight of what was happening for the past month, but had understood perfectly well that the adults were frightened, started crying with the wholehearted release of a child who has been holding his breath for 30 days without knowing that's what he was doing. Clara stood on the step and watched all of it. She had not cried at the courthouse. She had not cried at the kitchen table. She did not cry now. But something moved through her chest that was so close to it that the distinction felt almost dishonest, and she pressed one hand flat against the doorframe and let herself feel the full unguarded weight of it. These 12 people. Her 12 people, coming home to a place that was still theirs. Mason was standing a few feet behind her. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel that he was there. That was enough. The evening that followed was the loudest the orphan home had been in Clara's 8 years of running it. The children cycled through every emotional register available to them: celebration and relief, and questions and more celebration and supper, chaotic in the specific beautiful way of a meal where nobody is managing themselves because nobody needs to. Lily explained the situation to her cloth rabbit in serious undertones throughout the meal, keeping it fully briefed. James used his good arm to gesture so expansively while telling Henry about the auction that he knocked his cup over, and Noah cleaned it up without being asked. Exactly the way he always cleaned things up without being asked, except this time he was smiling while he did it. Mason sat at his place, Lily's designated seat beside him, naturally, and he ate and listened and answered questions when they came his way. And Clara watched him across the table, with the feeling she'd been having more and more over the past weeks, that this man had arrived to fix a fence and had become, without fanfare or declaration, the steady axis around which all of them now turned. After supper, after the dishes, after the younger children were in bed, the older ones gathered in the main room with the unspoken understanding that tonight was a night for sitting together a little longer than usual. Mason read Lily had claimed her story before bed, and the reading had become the ritual it always was, except tonight the older children drifted in and stayed, and nobody pretended they were only passing through. When Lily was carried to bed and the younger ones finally settled, Noah and Grace and Dora and the others gradually, naturally, drifted towards sleep, until the house was quiet again, and Clara and Mason sat at the kitchen table for what felt like the 10,000th time, and what felt like the first. She asked me again, Mason said. Who? Lily, before she fell asleep. He wrapped both hands around his cup. She asked me if I was going to keep coming. Clara looked at him. What did you tell her? He paused. I should have asked you first. No, Clara said. You shouldn't have. He looked at her. This is your home, she said. You made it that. You don't need to ask permission to come back to something you built. Mason was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. I need to tell you something, he said. Clara waited. When Eleanor died, he said, I decided that the only honest way to live was to stop expecting anything from the future. Not in a dark way, I wasn't broken. I just decided that hope was a liability. That wanting things led to losing them, and losing things hurt more than not having them had. He turned the cup in his hands. I ran that ranch on that principle for 7 years. No attachments I couldn't afford to lose, no plans that extended past the next season. No people I'd miss enough to matter if they left. He stopped. And then you opened that door, he said. Clara held very still, and there was a 4-year-old who called me the firewood man, he said, and a 16-year-old who climbed onto a roof without being asked, and 12 children who had already lost everything and were still somehow the least cynical people I had ever met in my life. He looked at Clara. And there was you. The kitchen was completely quiet. Clary said, Mason, she said. I'm not a man who does this easily, he said. Talking, saying the thing. I'd rather fix something or build something or show you with work what I don't know how to put into words. I know, she said, but I think you deserve the words too, he said. I think you've been running so long on not being told things that matter that somebody ought to tell you. He met her eyes. I love this place, I love these children, and I love you. Not in a way I'm in a hurry to do anything about. Not in a way that makes demands on you or changes what you've built. Just in the honest, plain way of a man who finally found the place he was supposed to be, and knows it. Clara looked at him across the table. 8 years. 8 years of carrying it alone. 8 years of learning not to want things she couldn't provide for herself. 8 years of standing in the dark before dawn with cold coffee and the weight of 12 lives, and no one to set any of it down with. I'm not easy, she said finally. I'm stubborn, and I run things my own way, and I don't ask for help well, and I have strong opinions about how the kitchen should be organized. I know, Mason said. I've been eating in your kitchen for a month. And I have 12 children. I know how many children you have, he said. I read to one of them every night and fixed another one's broken arm and taught one how to roof a barn, and spent more time thinking about the other 9 than I have spent thinking about my own livestock in a considerable while. Clara looked at him. Something in her, the last held thing, the final piece of the careful architecture she'd built around herself over 8 years of doing everything alone quietly and completely let go. "I love you too," she said, in case that wasn't visible. The corner of his mouth moved. "It was visible," he said. "I didn't want to assume." "You're allowed to assume some things," she said. "Good to know," he said. They sat at the table a little longer than they needed to. In the firelight, in the quiet house, and nobody needed to name what was happening, because it had been happening for 30 days, and now it simply had words to go with it. And the words fit exactly the shape of the thing they described. The weeks that followed were the most ordinary weeks the Whitmore orphan home had ever known, and ordinary had never felt so extraordinary. Mason came every morning, not because he had a fence to fix or a roof to repair everything that needed fixing had been fixed, but because he came. Because the children set his place at breakfast without being told. Because Noah had started asking him questions that had nothing to do with roofing or water troughs and everything to do with what a man did with his life when he was trying to build something that mattered. Because Lily had decided, with the unilateral authority of someone 4 years old and entirely certain of her own conclusions, that he lived there now, and no amount of factual clarification had yet persuaded her otherwise. He didn't correct her. Clara noticed. 3 weeks after the auction, Aldridge returned from Helena with the completed trust documents. He laid them on the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and walked Clara through every provision, with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the people across from him needed to understand exactly what they were signing and not simply trust that it was right. The trust was ironclad. The property, both parcels, the original acre and the Hendricks land, was held in perpetual trust for the benefit of the children of the Whitmore orphan home. No single person owned it. No creditor could touch it. No future land acquisition effort could legally challenge it without navigating a framework that Aldridge had, with evident professional satisfaction, made as difficult as possible to penetrate. There was one additional provision. Clara read it twice. Then she looked up at Aldridge. "He added a board of stewardship," she said. At Mr. Calloway's request, Aldridge confirmed 3 members. You as founding operator with permanent voting authority. A community representative to be elected by the families and women who have materially supported the home. And a 3rd seat designated for a community elder, currently nominated as Judge Patterson. He paused. Mr. Calloway specifically declined to include himself as a board member. Clara looked at Mason. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe with his arms crossed. "It's not my home," he said. "It's theirs. My name on a board changes what it is." "It is your home," Clara said. "I live here, some would argue," he agreed, with a glance toward Lily's empty chair. "That's different from owning it." Mason Clara, he met her eyes. "I know what I did. I know what I put in. That's not nothing, and I'm not pretending it is. But the moment I sit on that board, people will see Mason Calloway's orphan home. And it has to stay Clara Whitmore's, because that's what it is. That's what you made it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 8 years. About every choice she'd made alone, and every fight she'd carried alone, and every morning she'd gotten up before dawn to build the fire, and make the coffee and carry the weight of 12 lives, without anyone to help her carry it. And she thought about a man who had spent 30 days for something that didn't belong to him, and had then structured his own contribution so carefully that his name would not overshadow the thing he'd helped to save. "You are," she said quietly, "the most aggravating man I have ever met." "Yes, ma'am," he said, without any apology. "Sign the documents, Aldridge," she said. She signed her name. The home was safe, not temporarily. Not contingently, permanently, legally in language that was designed to outlast every person in that room. The children of the Whitmore orphan home had a place. Not a facility, not a county arrangement, not a bed they occupied at someone else's convenience. A home. On the morning the documents were filed with the Helena Land Office, a fact confirmed by telegraph that arrived at 11 o'clock on a Friday, Clara told the children at lunch. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't a woman who made speeches. She simply set down the telegram and said, In her plainest voice, the home is protected. Legally, permanently, nobody can take it. The table went quiet. Then James said, with the particular tone of someone who needs to hear a thing twice to trust it, nobody? Ever. Nobody, Clara said, ever. James looked at his splinted arm. Then he looked at Mason. Then he looked back at Clara. Because of the trust, he said. Because of a lot of things, Clara said. Because people showed up, Noah said. He said it quietly, to the table more than to anyone in particular. But everyone heard it, and everyone knew what he meant. The first snow came in November, earlier than usual, the kind of hard, fast storm that the old-timers said meant a severe winter. The children woke to it with the uncomplicated joy of people for whom snow still meant wonder, rather than hardship. And by mid-morning there was a battle of significant strategic complexity being conducted in the yard by 10 children in varying states of winter preparedness. Mason was in the middle of it. Clara watched from the window. She had come to watch 5 minutes ago, intending to call them in for the morning lesson, and had not yet called them in, because what was happening in the yard was something she was not prepared to interrupt with academics. Mason was losing the snowball battle deliberately. This was evident from the complete absence of tactical competence in his defensive posture, and the very specific way he was failing to dodge projectiles that a man of his size and coordination could have easily avoided. He was losing in the specific dedicated way of an adult who has decided that losing is the correct contribution to make to this particular fight. And the children were winning with the absolute wholehearted conviction of people who believe they have genuinely overpowered a large rancher through superior skill. Lily was on his back. She had arrived there at some point in the previous 5 minutes and had established herself with both arms around his neck and her rabbit tucked under one arm. And she appeared to be operating in some capacity as either a commanding officer or a ballast. It was difficult to determine which. Noah was laughing. Clara pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Noah was laughing, not the managed, controlled almost smile she had watched him produce over 3 years of careful self-protection, but actually laughing, with his whole face, in the specific unguarded way that is only possible when a person has stopped waiting to be disappointed and has started simply living. She had wondered for 3 years what that would look like. It looked like this. She felt Mason before she heard him the back door, the stamp of boots, the sounds of a large person removing snow-covered outerwear. She turned from the window. He came into the kitchen, with his coat in one hand and Lily still attempting to maintain her grip on him with the other. Making the transition from outdoors to indoors with the focused negotiation of a man managing a small and very determined barnacle. "You let them win," Clara said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mason said. He detached Lily with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for weeks and set her on her feet with a gravity that suggested the matter was beneath discussion. "Henry thinks he's undefeatable now," Clara said. "Good," Mason said. "Henry needs to think that for a few more years. Reality will catch up with him soon enough." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. "You're a good man," she said. Simply, not as a compliment, exactly as a statement of observed fact. He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he always looked when she said something that was true and direct, and gave him nothing to deflect with. "I'm trying to be," he said. "You are," she said. Lily, who had been listening to this exchange while conducting some sort of investigation of her rabbit's ears, looked up and said, "He's the best man," with the settled authority of someone closing a debate. Mason looked at the ceiling. "Lily," he said. "You are," she said simply, and went to the kitchen table and climbed into her chair as if the matter were fully resolved. It was, as far as she was concerned. The winter was hard as predicted. The snow was deep, and the cold was severe, and there were 2 weeks in January where the temperature dropped far enough that the older children learned very quickly what Mason had known all his life, that cold at that level is not an inconvenience, but a fact, a serious and uncompromising fact, and that responding to it correctly is a skill worth having. He taught them, all of them, how to stack the firewood so it dried and burned efficiently, how to check the pipes before the deep freeze, how to read the weather in the way the clouds moved and the animals behaved, the information that the land was always offering to people who paid attention. He taught James how the barn pulley system worked, every piece of it, exactly as he had promised, and James absorbed it with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting months for this conversation and was not wasting a word of it. He taught Noah how to manage livestock through a hard winter, the specific decisions about feed rationing and shelter that kept animals alive when the cold was at its worst. They spent 3 days doing it together, Noah asking questions and Mason answering them, and at the end of the 3rd day Noah said quietly, "This is what you do when you run the ranch alone." "It's a lot," Noah said. "It is," Mason agreed. "I'd like to learn more of it," Noah said, "if that's all right." Mason looked at this boy who had arrived as 9 stone of silence and suspicion, and had become, over months, someone steadier and surer and more genuinely himself than Clara would have thought possible when she'd first met him, and he said, "I was counting on it." Noah worked at the ranch on Saturdays through January and February. Clara drove him out and picked him up. The first Saturday she stayed in the wagon and waited. The second Saturday, Mason came out to the wagon when she arrived to collect Noah and said, "You don't have to wait in the cold. Come in." The third Saturday she came in without waiting to be invited, and Mason poured coffee without asking, and that was how Saturday mornings at the ranch became part of the structure of their lives. She learned the ranch the way she'd learned everything, by paying attention and asking the right questions, and doing what needed doing when she saw it needed doing. She helped with the feed records one Saturday when Mason was occupied with a difficult situation with a sick animal. She reviewed the supply invoices another week because his filing system was, in her precise assessment, a mild catastrophe. He did not argue with this assessment. He let her reorganize it with the equanimity of a man who understood that some fights had clear outcomes and the energy was better spent elsewhere. "You're reorganizing my business records," he said once, watching her. "Your filing system is organized by approximate memory," she said. "That's not a system. It's always worked for me." "You've always run it alone," she said. "Alone, you only need your own memory. This needs to work if you're sick, or traveling, or occupied with 12 children." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable point," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled. In February on a Saturday when the snow was deep and Noah was working with the cattle, and Lily had fallen asleep in the big chair by the ranch house fire with her rabbit under her chin, Mason sat across the kitchen table from Clara with the Saturday account books between them and said, "I want to ask you something." Clara looked up. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "Not because things aren't already, not because this isn't already." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at this part, I know," she said. "Ask anyway." "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because it changes anything practical. Not because we need a document to make what we already are more real. But because I want to say, in front of this town and these children and anyone who's watching, that I'm choosing you. Plainly. The way you chose them. The ranch house was very quiet. The fire. The winter outside." Clara looked at this man across the table. This man who had come to fix a fence and had ended up rebuilding the entire foundation of her life, and then structured his own contributions so carefully that her name stayed on everything he'd helped to build, and she thought about every morning she'd stood in the dark before dawn with a cold cup of coffee and believed she was going to carry the weight alone forever. She thought about Lily at the door. He won't let them take it. She thought about Noah on the barn roof, holding the lumber steady without being asked. She thought about 12 children who had already been abandoned by the world, and who had, against every reasonable expectation, found the thing they'd lost. "Yes," she said, no hesitation, no calculation, just the word, simple and complete, the way the best answers always are. He reached across the account books and took her hand. He held it the way he did everything, steadily, without excess, with a care that was entirely serious and not required to announce itself. They were married in April, when the ground had thawed, and the Hendricks parcel was being turned for the first spring garden. The ceremony was in the yard of the orphan home because there was no other place that made sense, and the children stood in the April cold in their good clothes and their varying degrees of patience with formality. And Lily served as some kind of self-appointed official, in a role that had not been asked of her, and that nobody thought to question. Ada Greer came, Hannah Reeves and his wife. Reverend Alcott, who performed the ceremony with the particular humility of a man who had arrived late to something and knew it. Judge Patterson sent a letter that arrived the morning of the wedding, which Noah read aloud at breakfast because it had been addressed, in the judge's hand, to all of them. It said, "I have been in the law for 30 years, and I have rarely seen a case argued more effectively than the one made in that courthouse last October, not by the lawyers, but by the people who simply refused to accept that what was right could be defeated by what was legal. That is the best thing the law can be shown. Congratulations to all of you." Noah folded the letter carefully. He placed it on the kitchen shelf where it stayed. The day after the wedding, everything was exactly the same and entirely different. Mason Calloway moved into the orphan home. His ranch remained his and was managed with Noah's increasing involvement. But his mornings began at Clara's table, and his evenings ended in the home that had become his, and he carried the weight of it with her, the way he'd always done, without fanfare, without requiring recognition. Simply by showing up every day and doing what needed doing. The children grew. James learned every piece of machinery on the property and began, by summer, drawing designs for improvements that Mason reviewed with the seriousness they deserved. Dora's singing stopped being a secret when Mason told her plainly one evening that he'd been listening from the hallway and that she had no business keeping a voice like that to herself. Bess and May stopped needing to hold hands when they walked into unfamiliar places, not because the world had become safer, but because they had accumulated enough safe ground to stand on independently. Henry became, as Mason had predicted, unavoidably acquainted with reality, but it caught up with him gently, because he had people around him who made the landing soft. Grace, who had managed them all through every crisis of the past months, finally had the room to stop managing and simply be 15. Which she embraced with the relief of someone who has been standing watch for a very long time and has finally been relieved. Noah turned 17 in June. On his birthday, Mason gave him something. He gave it without ceremony, at the breakfast table, sliding it across to the boy between the salt pork and the coffee cups. Noah picked it up. He read it again. It was a letter from Mason to the Helena Land Office, registering Noah Whitmore as the designated secondary manager of the Callaway Ranch operations, with formal rights to act in Mason's capacity in matters of land, livestock, and property management. Noah looked up. "This," he started. "You've earned it," Mason said. "You've been running that operation with me every Saturday for 6 months. You understand it as well as I did at 20. He picked up his coffee cup. "Someday it needs to go to someone who'll run it right. I'm not in a hurry, but I wanted you to know that I know who that is." The kitchen was very quiet. Noah looked at the document. He looked at Mason. He had been a 9-stone silence for 3 years. He had watched every adult from behind the careful walls of a person who had decided that watching was safer than trusting. He had stood at the gate and delivered 2 words we won with more feeling in them than most people put into whole speeches. He had said with the flat, honest courage of a boy who knew what abandonment felt like in his bones, "Let him fight." He said now 3 words. "Thank you, sir." And Mason said 4. "You earned it, son." The word sat in the room. Nobody moved. Then Lily said, from her chair, without looking up from her rabbit, "Is there more bread?" And the moment became a morning again, the way mornings do, ordinary and irreplaceable. Years later, when people in Harlan Creek told the story, and they told it often, because it was the kind of story a town holds onto, the kind that defines what a place believes about itself, they told it the way all the best stories are told. Not perfectly, not with every fact in its right order, but with the parts that mattered intact. They told about the eviction notice nailed to the door before dawn. They told about the quiet rancher at the feed store who didn't know his firewood deliveries had been traced. They told about the supper invitation and the 4-year-old who called him the firewood man, and the look on his face when she did. They told about the town meeting and Ada Greer's voice carrying to every corner of the room. They told about the auction and Morrison standing up and 2 words that cut through everything: "It's a home." They told about the trust that protected it forever. They told about a woman who carried 12 lives for 8 years alone, and a man who showed up to fix a fence and never entirely left. And the children who grew up and went out and built their own lives with the particular foundation of people who have been chosen when they had no right to expect it. They told it too. Each of them in their own way, with the details that had mattered most to each of them. James told the mechanical version, the pulleys and the roof and the work. Dora told the singing version. Noah told it the way he did everything straight, without embellishment, with the weight of it in the plainness of the words. Lily told it the simplest, the way she always had. She said the firewood man came for supper, and then he stayed. That was the whole story, and it was exactly right, and it was true in every way that the best things are true, not just in the facts of it, but in what the facts meant, and in what they built, and in what they left standing long after the people who had lived it were gone. The Whitmore orphan home stood for 60 more years. It held hundreds of children, one at a time, in the rooms where 12 had first been saved. And every winter, without fail, the firewood arrived early. Nobody signed the deliveries, nobody needed to.